It gives me great pleasure to take part in the launch of another book for the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Out of respect for the Dean, who always makes 3 points when he speaks, I shall only make 2. The first is to say that reading Kishore Mahbubani has been an education for me, a sort of Wang Gungwu's progress in understanding Singapore thinking in the world of geopolitics and public policy. In 1998, after I had been back in Singapore for 2.5 years, I read Kishore's first book and launched it at the Pyramid Club. The book was Can Asians Think? It was not the first thing I read by him. A few years earlier, I had read his memorable essay, The West and the Rest. And that was about the end of the Cold War, after Francis Fukuyama had written his book on the end of history, and The Last Man, and about the time that Samuel Huntington brought out his very influential essay, The Clash of Civilizations, something of a reply to Fukuyama's optimistic claims. Now, Kishore's essay was part of the Asian values debate, and it was his response, a sharp response, to the triumphant mood in the West at the time. Thus, when his book, Can Asians Think, was published, I was delighted to be among the first to read it. The book was an eye-opener for me. He asked a question no one in Asia had ever asked before. It was like going to grade school to confront something naughty and sacrilegious. A memorable moment on the day of the book launch, I recall, was a Singaporean friend came up to me and said, Asians may not be able to think, but Singaporean civil servants can. Kishore left for New York soon after the launch to be ambassador to the United Nations, and I admired him for years from afar. The year after he returned to be the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School in 2005, he asked me to launch his second book, this time on the NUS campus. The book, Beyond the Age of Innocence, told Americans how to rebuild trust between them and the rest of the world. I was by that time no longer innocent. And on the second stage of Kishore's odyssey, I've been following him around, and I thought the book had left the Fukuyamas and the Huntingtons well behind. He was questioning several American myths and left many of his American friends wondering what to think. 3 years later, early in 2008, Kishore took another leap forward by publishing The New Asian Hemisphere. Here, his strong message was that global power was shifting eastwards. I was prepared for this one, having taken part a few years earlier in a conference that produced a volume entitled Power Shift, which was a set of essays that focused on China's rise. So when Kishore asked me to launch this book, I was happy to come aboard and to travel beyond China and to take on the broader shift in global power. The impact of that book on readers around the world demonstrated how accurately Kishore had identified the impending movement of tectonic plates. It was particularly appropriate that the launch, which I did that time, was at the Raffles Hotel in Singapore, which is Singapore's most famous memorial that marked the height of Western imperial power. After graduating from Kishore's Odyssey program and made progress to understand how Singapore works, I was not too surprised to be asked to launch his latest and fourth book, The Great Convergence, as you can see there. He knows that I can now manage because I'm now learning at the Lee Kuan Yew School, a most innovative public policy school where great convergences are taking place right now. Now, having been with Kishore from the beginning, I have seen him make the school not only widely relevant, but poised to integrate some of the best ideas on offer about the worldly art of governance. And that art will be indispensable if the global Great Convergence that he speaks about is to overcome the many obstacles that Kishore knows are in the way. Now, with the issue of governance, this brings me to my second point. Governance takes us to the heart of Kishore's new book. He first gives us the good news, and he gives us quite a lot of good news. Among others, he highlights the economic growth that benefits more people than ever, the knowledge advances and new technologies being shared around the world, the middle classes that are bonding everywhere, and the reports that show that we humans are now less disposed to go to war and kill other humans. He then turns around to show that he knows the real world, and he sets out to outline the underlying irrationality in our leaders and all the possible contradictions in existing institutions that would have to be dealt with. The Great Convergence has begun to happen and will happen a great deal more, he argues, I think quite rightly. But it can do with some help in a global order that itself enjoys good governance. There are obviously many levels of governance problems, most of which are matters that a school of public policy would be the appropriate place to examine and find solutions for. As Kishore outlines the different features in good governance, he leads us to the very heights of global governance, where nations all round have been demanding change. He offers a bold solution as to how the United Nations can really be reformed to give the world a fairer and more acceptable structure of governance. He is uniquely qualified to do this, as he is someone who has seen the United Nations members, all the member nations, struggle for decades to get around this outdated Security Council system that is in use today. His formula is more representative, more democratic, if one can use that word here, and makes a lot of sense. He sees three tiers of nations with the largest seven at the top, all contributing more for that privilege. And then the middle tier, electing 7 more of its members to join the first 7, and the third tier, electing the remaining 7. This is his 7-7-7 formula. He arrives at this after having seen all the other combinations and permutations that had failed during the several decades of vigorous discussions all around the world. Now, will the world now turn to this rational scheme that he offers? They will have to act eventually. Let me quote Kishore's answer to any doubter, and I quote, "The great minds on our planet will have no choice but to focus on how we manage the small, dense, and deeply interconnected global village that we have created." Unquote. As one might expect on this Kishore Odyssey that I've embarked on, this image recalls his well-known analogy of us all being on the same boat and why we cannot afford not to have a captain any longer. I shall leave you with Kishore's formula and ask you to read the book for the full argument as to why it is the best possible today. Let me conclude by saying my Kishore education has been slow, having taken me 17 years from the time when I first met him in Singapore. But as you can see, there is logic, there's progress, there's logic in my progress. And I had to go from a primary class of thinking to get to the secondary course to transcend the innocence of American power. I then had to advance to college-level measurements of power shifts and follow Kishore's bold predictions. And now, finally, I have reached, at his School of Public Policy, the highest stage of the pursuit of global governance, nothing less than how to run the world. I hope that Kishore will now be persuaded that I have truly passed all my tests, all his tests. Kishore has just come back from a grueling series of book launches, launching his new book around the world. He has left to last, but not least, his hometown, Singapore, to round off his determination to get his global governance idea recognized. That would be his cap on the Great Convergence that he foresees for all of us. Thank you.
Now, for the man of the moment, I'd like to invite on stage now the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the author of The Great Convergence, Asia, the West, and the Logic of One World, Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore.
Professor Wang Gungwu, Mrs. Wang Gungwu, distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please let me join Professor Wang and Peggy in welcoming you to this book launch. But let me begin by quoting what Elizabeth Taylor said to, I think, her fifth or sixth husband. Please do not worry, I will not detain you for long. But by now you already, people seem to know me quite well, and Professor Wang has given away my secret that I only speak in 3 parts, only make 3 points. So this is what I will do. In the first part, I have to say a few thank yous. In the second part, I'll speak about the book, which is the bulk of my remarks. And the third part, I will end with a commercial. But it'll be a surprising commercial. You have to wait till the end to discover what it is. First of all, the 3 thank yous I need to do. I want to begin, of course, by thanking Professor Wang Gungwu. It's actually amazing that he had to suffer through 4 book launches. And yesterday when we were in the lift discussing it, he says, Kishore, enough is enough. No more, okay? But I thank you once again, Gungwu. You saw what a brilliant job he's done. He can remember each book launch, describe each book, describe the passage of my ideas, and you cannot possibly ask for a better guest of honor. So a special round of applause for Professor Wang, please. Secondly, of course, I do want to thank Keppel and especially my good friend Chu Chao Beng for kindly agreeing to sponsor this event. Traditionally, when you come to a book launch, you only get food for thought, but today you'll get fine wining and dining. So a special round of applause again for Keppel. And thirdly, I especially want to thank each and every one of you. I mean, I know how busy your schedules are. I know how much you have on your calendar. So it's really wonderful to have you here with us today. And I also want to thank my family members. You'll see later there, I've dedicated the book to the grandchildren of my parents. And I'm glad that they're here today to be present at the unveiling of the book. With that, now that I see that the room continues to fill up, welcome my new friends again here. Let me briefly describe the book. And my job has been made so much easier by many brilliant insights that Professor Wang Gungwu has already given you. But I have, it's a 90,000 word book, took a 1.5 years of toiling to produce. But I have, in anticipation of the fact that I was going to speak to this extremely busy group of people, I prepared an executive summary in 3 parts. And to make you remember it, since Peggy mentioned I was on Farid Zakaria's show, GPS, my acronym for my summary is also GPS. G stands for good news, P stands for problem, and S stands for solution. And in 5 minutes, I'll give you the executive summary of the book. In terms of good news, it's actually quite remarkable how much good news there is in the world today and how little note we have taken of this good news. Because, you know, when you pick up the newspapers, as you know, all you get is bad news. And indeed, one of the reviewers of my book, I think it was the Washington Post, said, you know, where is Kishore Mahbubani? Doesn't he read newspapers? Does he know there's a war in Syria? Does he know there's a war in Mali, a war in Afghanistan? Yes, all that is true. But if you add up all the populations of the world that are now experiencing war or conflict, it is a drop in the ocean of 7 billion people. And indeed, since statistics have been kept, the number of people dying in interstate conflict, number of people dying in interstate wars, is the lowest it has ever been. Unfortunately for me, as I was writing the book, a Harvard professor called Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which makes a very powerful case to show how indeed violence is diminishing. And that's tremendous good news. On another front, in terms of elimination of poverty, when I was ambassador to the UN, and I've been ambassador to the UN twice, I remember when people used to talk about this global goal of eliminating poverty, the general feeling is that this would take forever and may never happen, right? And amazingly, when the UN set some Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000 to halve global poverty by 2015, this is one of the few MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, that the UN will actually meet. And not just meet, the UN will exceed this goal. And what is even more remarkable is that a very conservative body, like the US National Intelligence Council, has confidently forecast that global poverty will be totally eliminated from the world by 2030. If this is not a great convergence, what is the Great Convergence? And if you look at another dimension, in terms of what's happening in the middle classes, here again a remarkable story is unfolding before our eyes. And, you know, I may leave you with a few statistics today, but if you want to leave this launch with just one statistic, then take away this one statistic, which is about the size of middle classes in Asia. Now, we had roughly, today in all of Asia, out of 3.5 billion people, about 500 million people who enjoy middle-class living standards. But by 2020, which is only 7 years from now, that number is going to explode from 500 million to 3.5 billion. Sorry, to 1.75 billion, an increase of 3.5 times in 7 years, from 500 million to 1.75 billion. Now, the world has never seen such a dramatic upliftment in the human condition ever in its human history. And that's why I felt that this had to be documented, especially at a time when you travel in the West, and I've just come, as Professor Wang said, I've been to 14 cities over 5 weeks. And when you go to the West, all you get is doom and gloom. And the larger story is being lost. And that's why I wrote The Great Convergence, to balance the pessimism that you find in the West. But of course, this doesn't mean that all the problems of the world have disappeared, which is why, in addition to the good news, and I have several chapters of good news in the book, I also have several chapters which discuss in as detailed a fashion as possible all the geopolitical challenges that we face. I mean, from US, China, to Islam in the West, to China, India, I discuss all that. These are problems, they are real, we have to deal with them, and I discuss them. But I do believe that the largest problem that we face is actually of a different nature. And this again, I'm glad Professor Wang gave a hint of it to you in his remarks. And what is this largest problem I speak about? The largest problem I speak about is about the dramatic transformation of the world in one dimension. And how do I describe this dramatic transformation? I use something you might call the boat analogy. What I say with the use of this boat analogy is that before, when 7 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, with captains and crews to take care of each boat, and rules to make sure that the boats didn't collide or clash with each other. And that's what the 1945 rules-based order was all about. But today, as a result of the world having shrunk, the 7 billion people in the world no longer live in 193 separate boats. The 7 billion people live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. But the problem with this boat is that you have captains and crews taking care of each cabin, and no captain or crew taking care of the boat as a whole. And once you absorb this boat analogy and you apply it to the real world, you begin to understand why so many of the global challenges go unmet. You saw this in the global financial crisis in 2008-2009. But what's striking about the global financial crisis in 2008-2009 is that when it became absolutely clear that no one country could save the world from the global financial crisis, you had a remarkable turn of events where the most unilateralist American president of recent times, George W. Bush, became the first to convene the G20 leaders meeting. And as you know, it was a subsequent G20 leaders meeting in London that saved the world. So why did George W. Bush do that? Because he saw that if he sat in his cabin, he couldn't fix the global financial crisis. So the world leaders converged, came to the bridge of our global boat and fixed the global financial crisis. But the tragedy is that as soon as the crisis was over, they went back to their cabins, and as you know, all subsequent G20 leaders meetings have failed. And that's the problem with our world. It takes a crisis to produce the global governance that we need. You see this in other dimensions. You see this in the response to global warming, where you can't get agreement because everybody is trying to protect the interests of their country or their cabin and not the global climate, global planet as a whole. And the key point I always emphasize is that if we fail in taking care of planet A, which is the only planet we have, we don't have a planet B. So we better make sure that we fix planet A, and that's why we need to focus on the global boat as a whole. I can give you other examples of how we are all on the same boat. The most dramatic example is provided by pandemics. You saw in the case of SARS how it began in a small village in China. From China went to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong went simultaneously to two cities on exactly opposite sides of the world, Singapore and Toronto. And what's remarkable is that Singapore and Toronto are two of the cleanest cities in the world. And what's the message from that? The message from that is that it doesn't matter if you keep your cabin clean on the global boat, you'll be affected by what happens in the rest of the boat, and that's why we have to work together if we're going to handle these global challenges. So it's very clear that the world has transformed itself and we have to deal with it. So this brings me to the solution. Now, most of us would think that fixing the world and the world order is very difficult. So this is another piece of good news. It's actually going to be very easy. It may just take a small little flip of the switch. See, somebody agrees. That was the flip of the switch. So what's the flip of the switch? And this is the flip of the switch is the result of a dirty little secret that I give away in my book. And what's the dirty little secret? The dirty little secret is that it has been Western policy for several decades now to keep multilateral institutions weak as possible. Now, this may or may not have served Western interests 20, 30 years ago, and I argue in my book that it certainly didn't serve Western interests even then, but it serves Western interests even less when the West makes up 12% of the world's population in a small global boat or global village. So the West needs to change course. And fortunately for me, as I was doing this research for this book, I happened to be visiting Yale and talking to Paul Kennedy there. And as I described to him my message, he said, Kishore, go back and read a speech that Bill Clinton gave in 2003 in Yale. And what did Bill Clinton say in the speech? He said, if America assumes that it can be number one forever, then fine. It doesn't matter. But he added, if we can conceive of the possibility that we can be number two, then surely it is in America's interest to work towards building a multilateral based world order, which, and he didn't add this, but it's pretty obvious, his logic was saying, which will then constrain the next number one that emerges, which is China. So clearly, it is now in Western interests to try and change their policies towards multilateral institutions. They haven't changed it yet, but I believe that they will do so if they read my book, The Great Convergence. And I must say that on this note, I can say that one of the most pleasant surprises I've had, and as many of you know, I've been kicked around and attacked quite violently sometimes in the Western media. One of the pleasures of this book so far is that I've actually got positive reviews for a change. A half-page positive review in the Financial Times, even a positive review in the Wall Street Journal and the Huffington Post. So clearly the signs are that I must have said something that is striking a resonant chord even among many of the leading Western minds. And so I'm sort of encouraged by the message that's coming. So I hope that with that I've given you a flavor of what the book says. And here now let me end with my commercial. Now I know you all think I'm going to ask you to go out and buy more copies of my book. Which I don't mind if you do that, by the way. But my real commercial is this. I've actually discovered, and this is a sort of one of the slightly disheartening features of living in Singapore, is actually people don't read many books. And it's a bit of a tragedy that at a time when the world is looking for more ideas from Asians, the one thing that I would like to encourage is more people to actually not just buy the book, but to read the book and then to discuss the book. That is actually for me much more important than the book sales. I mean, you can be honest, I don't make much money from the book sales, but I get far more pleasure when people read the book. And then, of course, if they attack me even better, it shows that they have actually absorbed the book. And so to emphasize how heartening it can be when people read books, let me end with a small anecdote of what I encountered in Davos some years ago. Must have been 2009, I guess January 2009, after my previous book came out that Professor Wang mentioned, The New Asian Hemisphere. And I just happened to be standing in one of the corridors of Davos, and a man walked up to me and tapped my shoulder and said, "Hey, are you Kishore Mahbubani?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Who are you?" He said, "Well, I'm the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. My name is Jan Pieter Balkenende." So I said, "Sorry, but how do you know me?" He said, "Well, my mother asked me to read your book." Now, I would love to have the day come when one of my Singaporean friends comes up to me and says, Kishore, my mother asked me to read your book. Then I know that I've arrived. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Prof. Kishore, I'm a research fellow. My name is Sashi, research fellow at the LKY school. If I could press you a little harder on the issue of UN and UNSC, specifically reform. You take some time in your book to explain this. You've explained this elsewhere in your remarks and interviews. There's something instinctively or instinctually which strikes someone as right on your proposal of 777. It's in the world's interest, and ultimately, as you point out, it's in the big powers' interest as well. But as Prof. Wang has alluded to just now, you've actually been there. You've been in the UN, you've walked these corridors of power, you've seen, I'm guessing, the inertia, and I'm guessing a fair degree of lethargy. So if I could just press you on this point, what are the actual likelihoods of this happening? And as a follow-up, if it did happen in the coming decades, the kind of reform you sketch out, would it be because the US and big powers see it as really in their interest, as you kind of suggest? Because right now, naysayers would say this is not happening, US administration is turning inwards. Or would it be because some of the other powers, what you call second-tier powers, bang so hard at the door, so to speak, they bang so hard that ultimately they force a crack, they force an opening, and they barge their way in? Thank you.
Okay, I'm really glad you asked the question. I'm really glad that Professor Wang mentioned my 777 formula. And let me just explain why I came up with this 777 formula. What I'm proposing is that the new Security Council should have 7 permanent members, 3 of the old ones who stay, United States, China, Russia, the European Union, which has a common European security foreign policy, has 1 seat, and then the 3 new members are the 3 most populous states of the 3 respective continents, namely Brazil, Nigeria, and India. And I have a formula how they arrived at that. So 7 permanent members of veto, and then 7 semi-permanent members coming from 28 states, the next middle powers, who automatically get a seat every 4 terms. So they will also automatically will be inclined to support this formula, and then 7 elected members from the small states. So what's new about my formula is the creation of these 7 semi-permanent states who come in every 4 terms. And why did I propose that? I proposed that because I discovered that when I served at the UN, the fundamental reason why Security Council reform did not take place is that for every new permanent member that wanted to come in, there was a neighbor that said, why not me? So for every Brazil, then Argentina that says, why not me? For every Nigeria, there would be a South Africa or Egypt that says, why not me? For every India, there would be a Pakistan that says, why not me? But the most ingenious one was, of course, the Italian ambassador to the UN when I was there, Paolo Fulci, because one day he got so exasperated when everybody was pushing for Germany and Japan to become permanent members. He suddenly stood up with great exasperation. He says, why are you just pushing for Germany and Japan? We, Italy, we lost World War II also. So you can see the jealousy that goes on among nation states. So that's why I believe that if you make the near losers also winners in this 777 formula, you will finally get this kind of thing. And so I do not appeal to ideals, to altruism, to principles. I just appeal to just sheer realpolitik logic. And I emphasize to the P5 that if you carry on with this council, nobody can remove you because you have the veto. But every day that you stay on, you're losing your legitimacy. And the biggest danger that the Security Council faces is that more and more countries will say, why should we bother about the P5? All that they have their only claim to fame is that they won World War II in 1945. Almost 70 years have gone by, the world has changed. We will ignore them. And that's a danger that they face. So I actually believe that for any idea that you put across, I can guarantee you that my idea will be rejected for the next 5 to 10 years. This is perfectly normal. But over time, when the council begins to perceive that it is losing legitimacy, the pressure to reform will come. And if you want a realistic formula for reform, then clearly it has to be the 777 formula. And I'm confident that over time it will work out in one way or another. And I also arrive at the figure of 21, by the way, because the United States has declared that it will not allow more than 21 seats. So I said, okay, I got a formula that even the United States can accept. Simon? Yeah.
Simon Chesterman, NUS Faculty of Law. Kishore, thank you for a wonderful presentation. On the Security Council reform, I've got two questions, one on Security Council reform and then one on the West and Asia. On Security Council reform, you and I were both in New York during one of the early pushes for Security Council reform in the context of larger UN reform. And I was one of those at the time who argued that it was a mistake to put this on the agenda because it was too easy and too hard. Too easy because, candidly, lots of people come up with models. Too hard because, as you highlighted earlier, it really takes a crisis to bring about global reform. You talked about the global financial crisis. That's also true of the architecture of international security, that it took World War I to lead to the League of Nations being established, World War II to lead to the UN, and the only change in the UN came about as a result of decolonization and the doubling of the membership. So is there a crisis that would come that would drive member states to actually push this, or would it just be the slow erosion of legitimacy? That's one question. The second question, much more briefly, I think ignorant criticism of your work is that you're too hard on the West. I think you are appropriately tough on the West and on the United States in particular. I'd be interested, however, in your response to the criticism that you're too soft on the East, and in particular that you're too easy on China. When a rules-based international system, I think you're entirely right, the United States should buy into it, but what leads you to believe that China would buy into it, for example, given its current attitude towards various international disputes? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm really glad that you asked those very tough questions, Simon. On the first one, as you know, the Security Council reform we've been discussing for almost 20 years. In 1993, they set up something called the Open-Ended Working Group on Security Council Reform. So after 20 years, people are saying, let's change the name from Open-Ended Working Group to Never-Ending Working Group on Security Council Reform. So it has not been going anywhere, and there are all kinds of political reasons why it hasn't happened. So I agree with you that if there is a crisis, then it will happen faster. That I certainly agree. But I don't anticipate, and this is, I guess, one of the problems of the good news book like mine, is that I don't anticipate such crisis happening. So I expect a very slow process of reform happening. And over time, if there's a perception of eroding legitimacy, that's what I think will lead to change. But I think your more interesting question is your second question, is, am I too soft on the East and too hard on the West? And it is, it is not a secret. I write stuff which is very, very hard on the West, and that partly because I feel that there's no level playing field. In the world of ideas, as you know, the majority of the ideas keep coming from the West, from New York Times, from London and elsewhere, and trying to get your point of view across when there's no level playing field. I've discovered that unless you really get, to use an American expression, unless you get in your face, you will not be heard. And that's why I adopt the tactics. But the paradox, incidentally, just to illustrate this point, is that this is actually the strength of the West, that the harder you criticize them, the more they want to listen to you. And for someone who's, again, I can publicly announce it now, for someone who's perceived to be anti-American, I've just been asked to serve on the council of the Center for National Interest in Washington, D.C. This is the center to look after American national interests. There are only 2 foreigners they selected to join. One is me and one is a Russian. So it is interesting that that they are open to this sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I think if people in the West read my book very carefully, I'm actually giving an argument which is an American national interest and Western national interest, which is that when you become number 2 in the world, it is actually in your interest to create a rules-based world. And I say quite openly in the book that if you want to ensure that you want to see the emergence of a China that is not an angry dragon, but a rules-based player in the world, the best way for America to do so is to create it while it is number one. Because if it doesn't do so today, every loophole that America creates in international law is a loophole that China will walk through. And you saw, by the way, evidence of this right here in this hotel one day at the Shangri-La dialogue when the Secretary of Defense, then Robert Gates, gave a very good speech calling on China to abide by the law of the sea convention and everything. And then when he finished and sat down, I think my friend, if I'm not mistaken, Barry Desker, stood up and said, Secretary Gates, thank you very much for calling on China to abide by the law of the sea convention. When is the United States going to ratify it? And you could almost see Robert Gates blush. You know, that's crazy. So in that sense, I'm telling the United States, this is in your national interest to do this. And so at the end of the day, I'm reasonably confident that after the initial wall of resistance, they will come round to the arguments. Thank you. Gopal? I see all my good friends and colleagues are attacking me.
Thank you, Kishore. I just wanted to follow up on the question from Sashi as well as Simon. First, let me thank you very much for that great presentation. I agree with you that the Security Council is quite dysfunctional. I agree with you that there's no impending crisis or any crisis in the near future that's going to bring about a major reform of the Security Council. But I don't think any of the formulas, I mean the ones presented by you in your book, or for the matter any of the other formulas that have been talked about, will bring about the kind of change that is needed to reform the Security Council. I think we tried thousands of formulas, none of them have worked. For many of the reasons you've given, for example, A blocks B because he's your arch rival, they don't want the arch rival in the Security Council, and so on and so forth. The other reason is also because there's a strong feeling, I think, in the UN that we have to end this use of the veto. The feeling is that the veto has been abused, and your suggestion to have a category with 7 countries keeping the veto, I think won't go down well with many. Would use that as an excuse, another excuse to kill your idea of Security Council reform. But can I ask you, you mentioned the G20. Do you think the G20 could possibly in some ways serve as the alternative to the Security Council? Because right now it's focused on economic and financial issues. At some point in time, the G20 might want to take on the political security issues. I mean, the G7 and G8 sort of grew out of focusing on economics and then moved on to security, political issues. You see the G20 doing that, and I ask that because the composition of G20 is quite interesting. It's made up of the 5 permanent members. It's made up of the potential aspirants, I mean the aspirants for a permanent seat, the G4, I mean the India, Japan, Germany, and Brazil. And then you have all the others, or the naysayers, you can say, also part of the G20. So all these guys who are there, checking on one another, all be in the G20. So do you see the G20 playing the alternative role to a reformed Security Council? Thank you.
Yeah, great. I suspect that even though Ambassador Vanu Gopalaman is asking me this question, he knows the answer better than I do to this question. But let me make just 2 points about the G20, which in a sense support the arguments I'm making. The first thing is, as you know, the G20 meeting was set up initially as a finance ministers meeting, if I remember correctly. If I remember correctly too, it was Paul Martin, who was then the Canadian Minister of Finance, and Larry Summers, who started the idea. And because Paul Martin believed that it's got to be more than G7 when it comes to financial issues, because the other countries are more important. They want to bring China, India in, and so on and so forth. That's how the G20. But it was always meant to be at a ministerial level, right? And never intended to be at the leaders' level. But suddenly, when a crisis happened, and they desperately trying to find a group to save the world, you say, the G20 exists, let's use it, right? So in a sense, if you don't plant the idea, if you don't put the seed in now, and don't have a budding plan, then it won't be there when a crisis happens. So the reason I'm putting this formula up now is that it's available, hopefully be discussed, and so on and so forth. And so if a crisis happens and they're saying, okay, we really got to fix the Security Council now, hopefully there's someone saying, okay, this idea looks reasonable, let's try it out, okay? So that, I know that that's the reason I'm putting it on the table, and the history of the UN, the history of all multilateral reform always shows that initially there's always rejection to an idea, but over time it is accepted. I mean, you take ASEAN, for example, how ASEAN has changed over the years. Your second question about can the G20 replace the Security Council and so on and so forth? The problem that the G20 has, and I guess the international lawyers understand this better than I do, is that it has no standing or legitimacy on its own. It is a self-created group that is not endorsed by the United Nations, not endorsed by the rest of the global community. But the advantage the UN has, the UN still has incredible legitimacy in the eyes of the majority of the world's population. And this is a point that many Americans don't get. That actually the legitimacy of the UN is a global asset that we can use to strengthen. So I don't think the G20, by the way, in the next financial economic crisis, the G20 will surface again. I have no doubt whatsoever. But I don't think they can handle the kind of political security issues that they were supposed to handle. So I actually, at the end of the day, I don't think the G20 can replace the Security Council. Please. This may be the last question. We're supposed to finish at 6:30.
Yeah, beautiful.
We want to give you some time for fine wine and dining too.
Okay, well, I have a very short question. Can I ask your view about how can the non-elite countries, for example, of the IMF and the World Bank, try to break this club? Because, I think your comment in your book has been that, like the IMF has been dominated by the Europeans, they will select the head, and the World Bank, by the US. So how do they break it? Because the whole ironic situation is like the non-elite members are actually funding them to, basically to the country's surpluses. Yeah.
Well, I'm actually more optimistic that reform will come easier to the IMF and World Bank than to the Security Council. Because in the case of IMF, World Bank, at least in theory, your share of the voting power in IMF is supposed to reflect your share of the global GNP. And as you know, the share of global GNP is shifting dramatically. I mean, when I speak in the United States, I shock the audiences by giving them a statistic. In 1980, in PPP terms, the US share of global GNP was 25%, and China's share was 2.2%. Now, come 2017, and I'm giving you IMF statistics, okay? Come 2017, the US share is going to decline from 25% to 17.6%, and China's share would have gone up from 2.2% to 18.2%. So in PPP terms, United States is going to become number 2 in 3 to 4 years' time. So, and when that happens, as your global share of GNP diminishes, then the formula ultimately will crack in. And when the formula cracks in, the European-American voting share will naturally go down, and the Asian voting share will go up. And that, I think, over time will lead to the end of this ridiculous rule we have, that to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. I see that rule disappearing. So with that, can I thank you all very much once again for your being here and for your support. Over to Peggy.
It's time for the unveiling of the book. I'd like to invite Prof. Wang to come back up on stage to join us. And the children, please. Kishore has dedicated the book to his parents' 8 grandchildren, and 6 of them are here today. Drum roll. Mr. Chu Chabin, can I also invite you up to stage, please, to be presented with a book. you. This brings us to the end of the formal part of today's program. Thank you again for joining us.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.